Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to do a wrap-up of a bunch of fantasy and science fiction. I have a good combination here of some really popular buzzy books as well as some that I think are hidden gems and don't get a lot of attention, at least not here on BookTube. So hopefully you will find something to your liking. All that being said, I have lots to talk about, so let's get started. Now, this time I actually want to start by talking about fantasy because I've read quite a few this month. I consider myself first and foremost a sci-fi reader, but every once in a while I go through just a binge of fantasy, and that's what happened here. The first one I want to talk about is Devil's Night Dawning by Damien Black. This is a self-published book that I heard about from Kitty G and other SBFBO bloggers, so I'll put her channel down below. Essentially, this is a very classic European-style fantasy story that is set in another world where there are different people that work as priests and exorcists, and so we follow multiple points of view. One is an apprentice to one of these exorcists, and the story starts out with them pulling a demon out of this young woman. This initial scene was so gripping and so dark and scary, and I absolutely loved it. I had read the sample chapter and was so excited about it that I did purchase the book, partially off of Kitty G's recommendation, and I'll have to say that I was slightly disappointed by this one. As someone who of course loves horror and loves exorcism stories, this one just did not have as much of that as I would have expected. It is a multi-POV story, and so you also get perspectives of a knight and also a young maiden, and you don't get to really see how their stories interconnect in this first book. And while we do primarily follow the apprentice and the exorcist, most of the story isn't actually about them exorcising demons, but instead they're sent on a mission, and so a lot of the story is them going through the countryside. Now, as I mentioned, this is a very classic piece of fantasy that is very much inspired by not only European culture, but specifically a lot of religious focus around Catholicism. It's technically not the Catholic Church in this book, but it's very heavily influenced, and so your enjoyment of this book I think will really depend on how you feel about European fantasy and Catholicism in your stories. I just found this book to be a little bit heavy-handed and a little bit dry. It's just very, very dense, lots of historical information, learning about the world, not necessarily info dumps, but just lots of paragraphs, lots of chapters of the characters talking and discussing the world, and it was just not quite what I wanted. I went into this book hoping for a really creepy fantasy style of an exorcism story, and that was a piece of this, but just a small piece, and it just wasn't enough for me. So if you like those classic stories, you might enjoy this one a lot more than I did. I tend to enjoy more diverse, non-European centric fantasy stories, which we're about to get to in just a moment. Next, I want to talk about The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wang. This is another indie published book that got quite a bit of attention here on BookTube in the last while, so you might have heard of it. It is told over two perspectives, following a boy who is being trained to protect his nation and also his mother. This is set in a secondary world, but it's very much inspired by Japanese culture, and this is technically a standalone even though it's part of a larger series of books set in this world. Now, I'll be honest, I like this book, but I did not love it as much as other booktubers. I've seen so many people give this book 5 stars, and while I definitely enjoyed it, I did think the book had flaws. And so this is a story that has a really interesting, fun magic system that is based around the elements, and it's very similar to something like Airbender. And if anything, that would be a complaint, that I felt like it was almost ripping off of the Airbender take on elemental magic. Certainly they're not the first ones to do it, but it's very similar. That being said, it was really fun. This book does have a lot of good action scenes. It was very easy to picture what was happening, and I could see this translating really well onto the screen. But I was a bit let down by the characters. I just found them to be a little bit flat, and I wanted them to be more nuanced, more complex. They just felt very simple simple, and I think I found myself comparing to other fantasy stories, particularly other Asian-inspired fantasy stories I've read that have much more three-dimensional characters. I also just found the characters to be naive in general. There's a lot of theming in the story around government propaganda, and the young son was shocked at the idea that this could exist and that governments could do this. And as a reader who has read plenty of books with politics, it just felt a little bit obvious to me. I did struggle also with the pacing in this book because while it has a really strong beginning, which leads into a fantastic climax, that climax happens around halfway through the story, and the rest of the story is basically a slow decline towards the ending. So while I would recommend this one, I just found this to pale in comparison to so many other fantasy stories that I love so much more. So if you're interested in picking it up, I would still encourage you to do so. I did like it, but I just personally don't feel like it truly lives up to the hype that is going around on BookTube. I think it is a good one, but definitely one with flaws, definitely a debut novel, or at least one that feels like that. I know the author has written other books before, and I wanted a little bit more from this one. After that, I read Across the Nightingale Floor by Lian Hearn. This is another Asian-inspired fantasy, specifically a fantasy story that is very much, again, inspired by Japanese culture. This follows a young man who, at the beginning of the story, his village is set in flame and he is rescued by a mysterious lord and taken into his family. From there, the young boy begins to discover his past and true heritage. He has these magical abilities where he has just an incredible sense of hearing, and that plays into the story in multiple ways. And this book was not necessarily the most original or unique fantasy story I've read. As you've probably noticed on my channel, I read a lot of Asian-inspired fantasy. It's one of my favorite areas to read in. And once again, like with Sword of Kaigen, I did find that this one was good, but just not as good as some of the other ones I have read. However, the story was very compelling and bingeable. I flew through this book in, I want to say, a single day, which says a lot. It's not overly long, but it was just a very engaging story. There's also another perspective of a young woman, and there is an element of romance in the story, which I found to be very insta-love. So I would say that the characters are not the strongest, the plot is not the most original, but if you are like me and just looking to spend more time in an Asian-inspired, specifically a Japanese-inspired story, this one did scratch that itch. I very much enjoyed reading it at the time and would definitely read more by this author. It's not necessarily an own voices story, but I understand that she has spent a lot of time visiting and living in Japan and has done a lot of research. So I thought those elements were really well done and very interesting. So still one that you might want to check out. Finally, for fantasy, I want to talk about Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse, and this is a story set in a secondary world that is inspired by the indigenous cultures that existed and flourished before the colonization of North America. And I just found this to be a fascinating story in terms of diversity and world building. It was just so creative because, as I mentioned earlier, classic European fantasy for me is very tired and it just is not my personal taste. And so this was everything that classic fantasy is not. The world building was so interesting. It's told from multiple perspectives, one being a sun priestess, another being a ship captain, and yet another who is a young man training to be part of this Carrion Crow religious type order. And it blends together different cultures, it blends together different ideas. This book has fantastic queer representation, including non-binary characters, which is very important to Indigenous culture, where people being two-spirited was once very revered, and I really like that that is tied into the story. You get to see people of different racial backgrounds, different skin tones, different relationships between different people are discussed very openly on the page. And in terms of the story, this one was very compelling. I found myself just enjoying reading it and enjoying to see where the story went. This is one where there isn't really a clear picture from the beginning where the end is headed, and instead I just found myself enjoying spending time with each of the characters, getting to understand the world, and you can tell that the author put a lot of time into the world building, and we as a reader are just getting a slice of it in this first book. So I thought it was just very compelling, very interesting, and while it was a slow build, eventually the pieces do come together, and I'll say that it got amazing. Basically around the 75% mark, the book just clicked for me. I saw how everything was going to tie together, or at least got an idea of it, and it was fantastic. I really enjoyed the ending, and I did like the setup. It definitely is a climax that leaves you wanting more, and I'm definitely going to continue on with the series. So highly recommend for anyone looking for some diverse fantasy that is just like nothing else that is out there. I would love to see more fantasy like this come out in the next few years because I am all for it. From there, I read The Martian Chronicles by Bradbury. This, of course, is a sci-fi classic that is about a series of Earth expeditions that were sent over to Mars to meet the local population. This is a novel, but in some ways it does read like a short story collection because each chapter is basically its own segment, and then with each new chapter they move forward in time and follow a different expedition. And oh my goodness, this book is so unique, so cute. So first off, extremely accessible, especially being a classic. There is virtually no hard science in there. I really don't think Ray Bradbury worried about that at all. Instead, this is a book that more reflects back on humanity using the lens of this story. At the beginning, this book starts out as so funny and so cozy because the Martians are adorable. I wanted to compare them to little hobbits, and they are very much person-like and very much similar to Earth in terms of their mannerisms and ideas and descriptions. Like, they're not meant to be this weird other alien presence, but very relatable, very accessible. And I just thought the expeditions were hilarious because they kept going the wrong way and things just kept going from bad to worse. However, as you go on with these stories, you do start to see what Ray Bradbury was doing, and he was writing this book to be a very smart analysis or commentary on humanity, like I said earlier, because it really does reflect what we do as humans and how we conquer and colonize and how we assume that others just should be like us and we don't value other people's values and so forth. So this book definitely got darker as it went and had some incredible endings to the different chapters. And I really like this one. I could see myself rereading this one and appreciating it even more with each reread and definitely becoming a favorite. At the moment, I gave it a 4-star rating, but again, I could see myself revisiting it and just appreciating it more and more because it is such a nuanced story. The themes are fantastic, and it's just short and smart and definitely worth your time. Again, even if you don't read classics, even if you don't read a lot of science fiction, I think this is a great one to pick up by just about anyone. I really liked it. Finally, I want to mention just one short story collection. I don't read a lot of sci-fi short stories, but I did read this one, Made to Order, Robots and Revolutions. This is a collection that is edited by Jonathan Strahan, and this I received from Rebellion Publishing for review. It took me a while to get to it, but this, as it says, is a collection of stories that are all about artificial intelligence. I felt like the tagline was a little bit misleading because not all the stories are truly about robots and very few of them were actually about revolution. However, I thought that this was a great collection with a lot of diversity in terms of author and also the variety of the stories within here. These stories, for the most part, were fairly intellectual and cerebral, although there definitely were a few that were just more goofy and fun. My favorite of the collection was No Surprise by one of my favorite SFF writers, and that was Ken Liu. It basically was this artificial intelligence story where there is technology that allows people to recreate the intelligence or beings of people that are either celebrities or deceased family members and recreate them in artificial intelligent bodies. And the story specifically follows a legal firm that uses this technology in order to prepare for court cases. And if you know me, you know that I love AI stories and I love legal dramas, and so that story was amazing because it brought it all together. There were definitely other stories I enjoyed which I have listed in my Goodreads review, but if you're interested in the topic, this one might be one to check out if you also enjoy some short stories every now and then. So that is it. We've made it to the end of the video, and I would love to hear your thoughts down below of the books I mentioned. Which ones are you most interested in? And you probably noticed that I really like my diverse fantasy, so please recommend me some of your favorites, whether they be Asian inspired or Indigenous inspired. I would love to get them on my own TBR if I haven't read them already. Otherwise, if you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing. I do read a lot of science fiction, fantasy, as well as horror and thrillers. You can still help me out with a thumbs up, sharing this around online, and hitting that notification bell so you never miss a video. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I'll be back again soon. Okay, bye-bye.